Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Jess Lenore in Baltimore. We now bring you part 2 of our discussion with our guest, Omar Dahi. He's an assistant professor of economics at Hampshire College in Massachusetts. He's an editor at the Middle East Report, and he's of Syrian descent. Robert Fisk of the Independent of London reports that Iran has decided to send 4,000 members of its Revolutionary Guards to Syria. Talk about this latest news in the context of the already expanding sectarian conflict in Syria.
Well, sectarianism, since the start of the Arab uprising, in my view, has been the primary tool of counter-revolutionary forces. As soon as the uprisings developed, starting in Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, Syria, and elsewhere, the Gulf Arab states initially employed sectarianisms for several reasons. The first reason is to try and turn the uprisings demanding social justice, demanding economic equality, demanding freedom, into a means of furthering their own influence in these countries and supporting the Sunni Islamist forces. For example, in the case of Egypt, the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood has been supported by Qatar directly. The second reason they initiated this is to stave off insurrection in their own countries and to suppress the to suppress what they feared would be democratic movements growing in the Gulf Arab region. And we have seen, in fact, a mass movement in Bahrain that was brutally suppressed by invoking the sectarian discourse. And in that, the Bahraini freedom movement was simply a tool by Iran to further its interest. So essentially, we need